Okay, so today I was doing a little bit of research. Now, you go into the law of one and you go into a lot of spiritual teachings. Today I want to kind of bring it down and make it more practical for our audience, and what happens to us when we go through these, what I might call identity crisis, where we've identified one way for a long period of time. Maybe you've been a student or a wife, or you've had some particular job or some spiritual belief. And all of a sudden something happens and that identity starts to wash away. And you find yourself in like this hallway of no longer being who you used to be, and not yet who you're quite going to become. How do we maneuver through that part of our life? And you've been through your own kind of identity shifts in life too. So first, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then let's dive into this identity issue thing.
Yeah, like you said, I grew up as a Christian, pastor's kid in church. Being a Christian was my whole identity the first 23 years of my life. So that was a pretty dark night of the soul for me when I left Christianity, because it was like, yeah, who am I without this identity, without being a Christian? Who is Aaron? And that was a very necessary part of the journey, of course, that led me to, at 27, having like a true spiritual awakening, which was a true spiritual awakening in my estimation is just the realization, like not a conceptual, like, oh, I watched an Eckhart video and he said this concept and I understood it, but like a deep insight and in-seeing, looking within yourself and having this epiphany. Oh, wow, I'm actually not my mind. I'm not this thinker. I'm not these ideas. I'm not any of these things my mind says I am. I am pure awareness. I am pure consciousness. And that experience can come about in infinite variety of ways. Really, all that's necessary to have that experience is to desire to know who you really are. And the prerequisite for desiring to know who you are is that you have to give up what you're not. And that's identities, right? All identities are false and untrue. All identities limit you and they actually weaken you. And you can't see that from the perspective when you're in that identity. It's when you really step out of it that you become aware of just how much you had weakened your self-perception through that little tiny lens that you had of who I am. I am this person. I am these memories. I am these desires. I want people to approve of me so I feel safer. This is what identity does. It has to be constantly protected, constantly lived up to. So you better expect that when you begin to transcend those false ideas of who you are, that your ego will throw up a temper tantrum and it's going to go kicking and screaming, right? It's not going to let you out so quickly and so easily. So that's really when we call the dark night of the soul begins, where you're in that space of not knowing who I am. Giving up the false in order to have the true is the prerequisite. And so that's always a difficult space to be in. But if you want liberation, if you want freedom from suffering, if you want inner peace, if you want your true nature to be how you experience yourself, then that's it's a part of the journey we all have to go through at one point or another, right? Whether you do that in this lifetime or whether 5 lifetimes from now you transcend this dream character you think you are, it's going to happen eventually, right? So I think when we realize that, there becomes a sense of urgency for like, all right, I want to wake up now. I want to get this over with. I want to know who I am.
I have a question for you, Aaron. To start with, though, when you're saying all of these things, the first thing that comes to mind is, what would you tell someone that has a lot of guilt to let some of those other ways go or to disappoint? Like, what's the first, if we're not in the space to where we can be like where you are, to not worry about all of those things, how do you take that step? And number one, I would think guilt of somebody who's been raised in a church or whatever, if they wanted to even explore this, that would, for some people, that would have to be a secret. I mean, it's so deep.
Yeah. Guilt is like the linchpin for the ego's programming. I have an 8-week masterclass, and the second module, the second week, we go deeply into guilt, and I have the students basically spend the whole week just like putting their antennas up and becoming aware of guilt. And it starts out, you become aware of the obvious things first, right? Like, I'm guilty for not being a good enough wife or mother or whatever. And as you just become aware of that voice of guilt, guilt is really when the ego believes you're not living up to your self-images. It's like, hey, you have this image of yourself, but you're not measuring up. You better, pick up the pace, man. Crack that whip, right? It starts doing that, and you start being aware of it. And then you start to realize, oh, wow, like my mind guilt trips me for literally everything. Like if I wake up 1 minute later than I should have, there's a little voice in the background saying, shame on you. You should have done better. If I spend too much time in the shower, if I burn the toast, like whatever, little things, right? Even the littlest, tiniest things, there's a voice that's trying to make you feel shameful for not living up to some kind of identity. And that voice of guilt is like the anchor point. Every little item of guilt you accept from ego becomes an anchor point that ego is sort of stamping in your consciousness that it can control you from, like lever arms, right? If it can make you feel guilty, guilt is the act of being identified, right? Guilt is you identifying. So that's why the ego wants you to be as guilty as possible, because then from its perspective, you'll do as much as possible to live up to those self-images. So really just being aware of guilt is the only thing you need to do, because the voice of truth, the voice of reason within you, your true self, will begin to say, hey, wait a minute, I don't need or want to feel guilty for all of these things. And then you begin to question and do that turnaround where you say, who's the one who's guilty? Like, who is that voice? Is that really me? Or is that something else? And that's when you have that flash of insight we call a spiritual awakening. Oh, I'm not that voice that's guilty. That's the ego, right? And I'm not that.
Okay, so just a little bit further though, because part of me thinks there's good guilt and then there's bad guilt, right? There's guilt for if you worry about what someone else thinks and blah, blah. But I thought the good guilt would be to keep you in check with, being aware of when you're doing something wrong that really, like if you're yelling at your kids, you would feel guilty for that. And for a good reason, because that's not a right thing to do. So that's where I need your help from, is when it is like per se the good guilt, because you shouldn't yell at your kids, versus, you shouldn't feel guilty worrying about living your own life, not what your parents think. How would you say the difference in that?
Yeah, that's absolutely like the ego's thought system. Good guilt is totally an oxymoron. There's no such thing as good guilt, but the ego paints it that way.
No, but I'm that's why I want to understand because this is the way brains work.
Absolutely. This is the way we're all programmed to think. And it's not even us doing it or us thinking that. It's the ego that believes that. If I don't feel shameful for all my missteps and mistakes, then I'll never do the right thing. That's survival-based thinking. From the survival mind, that makes sense, right? If my survival is all that matters, then it never benefits me to think in the positive. Because if, from a survival standpoint, if I'm thinking in the positive, assuming the best, and I'm wrong, I could get eaten by a predator, right? Better to assume there's danger around every corner and every possible negative outcome might actually happen. Better to always be aware of that than not. Because if I'm thinking about negative things and they don't happen, well, I'm safe anyways. So it's like better safe than sorry is the game ego's always playing. So whatever identity you erect and say, that's me, I am this person, this thing, this role I play, whatever, ego will crack that whip to force you to live up to that identity, which is just slavery. So all identity is slavery, and the slavery is the guilt. So this is a phase of spiritual awakening that I refer to as the walking the dog phase, where you become aware that I'm not that voice in my head. But in the same way, when you walk your dog, you're not your dog, right? I'm not my dog. But if my dog craps on somebody's lawn, I'm still going to clean it up. And so I didn't do that. Moving on. You'd be a horrible dog owner, right? You still clean up your dog's mess. So in the same way, I'm not that voice. I will not identify with that voice to any degree, because that keeps me trapped in it. But I will clean up its messes, because it's just conditioning running. It's just the way the body, mind, organism has been conditioned to react. So if an angry response comes out of me at my kids, Well, I'm not the doer. The brain did that. That was an automatic response to stimulus. I had no awareness to stop that from happening. So let me not identify with that by being guilty from it. The guilt is the release from it, because guilt is the cause of all suffering. But if I do notice a distorted reaction comes out of the person that's not in alignment with who I know I am, pure love, right? Then I will clean up that mess. I will say, hey, I'm really sorry that I said that to you. I didn't mean that. Please forgive me. But inwardly, I'm not being, why did I say that? Boo-hoo, poor me. I have this awareness. I'm not the ego. I'm not that voice. And over time, when you abide in that awareness, that voice goes away. But when you feel guilty for that voice, you will perpetuate it and keep it alive.
Wow, that's so freeing, Aaron. Wow.
It is, right?
I mean, you literally get to be free of that mean voice. I like that.
Yes. Be free right now, right? Don't wait till the voice completely is gone and, oh, now I'm free. You're already free. You're not that voice. You just have to know that.
That's
so
great.
why do we have this? Like, if it doesn't serve us and we're trying to recognize it so we can get rid of it, why are we even designed this way? Why does this voice even exist? Why do we hold identities? Why is our culture so surrounded by what identities we have? And they matter. We need to be a wife. We need to be a graduate. We need to be a business owner. We need to be. Why even have that as part of our makeup if it's not something that really is of benefit for our evolution?
Yeah.
Do you have an answer for that?
Oh, yes. Maybe
I want to know.
But, the ego is a very divine mechanism that source consciousness has created. Ego is that mirror that the source consciousness holds up to look at itself, right? The source can only know what it is by looking at what it's not, because it is itself. It is love. It is peace. There's no other God that can walk over to God and have a conversation, be like, hey, did you know that you're love and like your peace? And here's what your nature's like. God is all there is. So how can God have a reflection of itself? It truly can't. It can't ever actually see itself because it's the eternal subject. So it creates this dream world we call the universe, and it projects itself into that dream world through the act of being identified. It has to identify as a finite form, a person, a body in time and space. And then going through the journey of suffering and pain and forgetting who I am and all this stuff, we have to wake up to our true nature if we want to stop suffering. So suffering actually is the grace point of the universe that is reminding us of who we really are, so we can experience love, so we can experience our nature. And when we get free from ego, when we get free from suffering, we look back at it with nothing but gratitude. All of the problems of the person no longer mean anything or hold any sway for me. They just were a means to an end to get me to this point of self-realization. And so the reason that ego evolved in the physical universe is really just a consequence of, again, survival and sort of like Darwinian evolution. Mm-hmm. If you think about when ancient humans, like 100,000 years ago, were just beginning to formulate language, right? Those ancient hominids or whatever, and on the plains of Africa, they would have had to start using those like guttural ape noises to label objects: rock, tree, banana, danger, predator, right? These are useful things to label. So the working mind can only know reality by labels. It can't actually know reality. It can just perceive. It just looks at how you perceive reality. And so labels are the mind's way, the survival mind's way of feeling safe. Like, I understand reality because if I have a label for predator, predators are bad. I have a label for food and water is good. Now I can feel a little bit safer about this cold, cruel world I'm living in, right? So that labeling process just kept on going. We began labeling everything, even one another. So I give you a label, a name, that when all of us make this one sound, you know, oh, that's my sound. My sound or my name now makes me an object to myself. So now I can conceptualize me in time and space. What's going to happen to me? Why did I do that in the past? These things now evolve in the brain, and we call that ego. So all suffering is either remembered in the past or anticipated in the future, right? And so that's why ego creates our suffering.
Okay, so my final question for you, and I don't know, Shelley, if you have one, but where are we going? Like, what's the point? What's the evolution? What is your ideal? So whether you're holding on to identities, whether you're in that dark night of the soul, whether you're on the other side of that, where's humanity going? What is your future vision for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an exciting question to talk about.
Okay.
We mentioned Law of One a bit before we got started, but the Law of One breaks down the evolution of consciousness into these 7 densities. And the ego is essentially the belief in separation. I am separate from life. I am a separate entity, individual, isolated from reality, and I have to look out for my own survival. I'm all by myself. That's kind of ego. And so ego consciousness is the 3rd density of consciousness, which, as we just talked about, is that state where, or that stage where consciousness does that about face and kind of flips in on itself and becomes an object even to itself. And we call that self-awareness. So self-awareness creates the belief in separation. And that belief goes on for, 75,000, 100,000 years since the advent of language. And eventually, through all the war and the calamity and the death and the suffering that separation creates, consciousness is forced, again, through that suffering as the catalyst, it is forced to begin perceiving a different way of looking at the world, of looking at myself. There has to be a way of perception that doesn't cause so much pain and misery. And so in that searching for that, consciousness evolves into the 4th density of consciousness, which is the awareness of oneness, where the perception of self sort of expands, not just to this little isolated body. I am the body is the ego's religion. That self-perception of I am the body goes out and realizes, oh, I'm the whole world. There is just consciousness. I am consciousness experiencing this body, but I am also consciousness experiencing that body, and everything in the universe is actually myself. And we call that love. So loving awareness is the 4th density of consciousness, and humanity is at that kind of precipice right now. We're evolving into that understanding. And in order to do that, we have to basically do some collective shadow work. We have to heal our 3rd density sins of the past, so to speak. All the things we've done to one another through believing we're separate from each other has created a lot of karmic pain in our collective. And we're seeing that process of us healing that pain. And, the pendulum will swing to either side and eventually will settle in the middle. And so right now we're kind of in a really extreme pendulum swing to this way. And over time, we will begin seeing the futility of these ways of seeing each other as separate and realize, actually, maybe we're all one. Maybe we're all equal in the eyes of God, and there is no separation between us. And that is the beginning of 4th density consciousness, or we could call it unity consciousness.
I love it.
Well, and I guess my last question for Aaron is, we're all about the flow and having a flow life. And I think all this spiritual stuff is really deep and it's so interesting. But how is that going to, if we were going to tell our viewers today, how would trying this type of a lifestyle help them to have a flowful life and to make the decisions because you don't stay in this, you live the spirituality, I'm sure, on a daily basis, but how will this help people to make decisions for their careers or for a happier marriage? Or, that might be too long of a question, but in some ways, is there something that you could your personal experience of how has this helped your life because we still have to live in this life. We can't just stay in this one state of search of our consciousness. And, that might be even too much for some people. They're not ready for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And really it's never about being on this searching journey, but it's just about accepting what is the fact of the matter. I am that. I am the source. I'm just going to live from that place as if it's true. And the mind will catch up to you. You can't wait for the mind to believe it because the mind won't believe it, right? It is programmed to believe you are separate, but it will surrender to your will if that's what you desire, how you desire to see yourself. So what we call the flow state is the absence of identity. There's no person who can be in the flow, right? As I'm sure you guys know. If you're, I always use Michael Jordan playing basketball because it's the easiest analogy. He called it being in the zone. And he would explain that to be in that zone, I couldn't be thinking about anything. I just had to be completely just reacting, just letting the body do its thing. No concept of like, oh, I'm Michael Jordan, I must make this shot. I must live up to these identities, right? Oh, I'm about to shoot this game-winning three. If I miss it, what will people think of me? Miss, right? You can't be in an identity and be in the flow state. It is the absence of the person. So truthfully, if you know how to get in the flow state with playing pool, playing basketball, playing piano, anything you enjoy doing that puts you in that flow, just understand like you can be in that exact same flow state with life. You can just be plugged into life, living from the state of no mind, no self. I am life itself. I am being lived, right? I'm not a separate person who's doing the living.
Wow.
There's no separate person doing the living, right? That's an illusion the mind creates through the act of being identified. Just to know I am life living itself, that's where the magic happens. Like the things that you believe that you desire, the person desires, better job, better this, whatever, you start to see, oh, these are just the universe's desires and they're flowing through this body. So let me just get out of the way and let those desires manifest through this body by being in the flow, by being present with life. As soon as I get present with life, life becomes your best friend. The things you want, and really you want, as a concession, they just present themselves to you. Opportunities just arise. Connections just happen. You have no motive other than being in the moment, being in that flow. The flow is the peace. The flow is the freedom. And in living from that place, you find, like Jesus said, you seek first the kingdom and all these things are just added unto you.
Wow. And I was just going to say the same thing. Just get out of your own way is the easiest way to explain this, and let it go and let it happen. So that's beautiful, Aaron. Thank you so much. Wow.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for being here. Don't hang up. We want to say bye to you once we end the broadcast. But everyone, thank you so much for listening and for tuning in today to another episode of Set to Love. Aaron, you are amazing. You are a wealth of knowledge. Where can people find you online if they want to dive more into your workshops, your teachings, and learn more from you?
I keep it easy. I'm just at Aaron Abke everywhere. AaronAbke.com, Instagram, Facebook. That's where you can find me.
Excellent. Aaron, you are a pleasure. Thank you so much. I love you, best friend. Thank you so much for being here again today.
Thank you, guys.